and welcome once again to my son and daughter-in-law's kitchen table. I'm sitting here with my son's wife, your therapist, and today I have been forced into hosting the show for price and by price.
Of course.
So today I'm going to ask Ash some questions about neurodivergence. I am a listener of this podcast. I hear one of the few, and and I.
Ouch.
But I'm your mom.
Thanks.
So I still have a lot of questions about neurodivergence, which I can't say right, and I'm going to mispronounce most of
Here's
the
your
times.
opportunity to say it like 500
Yes,
times.
I'm not good at it. I'm not good at it. But our goal for this conversation today is to give us a greater understanding of neurodivergence and people who are neurodivergent and how the rest of us can understand and appreciate them, all the ways that they make our life better on this planet, but also help us navigate accepting and accommodating them. So, if you do find this conversation helpful, please take a moment to share the podcast with your friends and family. As a Generation X, I'd like to say there are probably many ways that you can share it. I don't know what those ways are. My suggestion is to write a letter and tell someone about it.
That surely is one way you could do it.
So I'm Lolly, and my son married your therapist.
I'm Ash, and I'm your therapist. Please keep in mind that even though this is a podcast about mental health and therapy, it's not the same thing as or a replacement for therapy. It's a lot. It's a mouthful.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot. So
I secretly feel like they probably know that this is a podcast and not therapy.
agreed.
Yeah. Okay.
But there's
just
an
checking.
attorney somewhere that would recommend to you to say that exact same thing every
That's
time.
what keeps me coming back.
I mean, just from listening, I almost have that memorized myself.
It's like our thing in our
It is.
community.
It is. I love it. So my first question is a question very big picture, very zoned out, big picture question. What is neurodivergence?
Yes, that's a great question. And there are a couple of terms that I think would be helpful for us to go over as we're starting this conversation. Our idea going into this conversation is that a lot of folks have friends and family who don't know a lot about it and aren't learning alongside you, and they probably have a lot of like 101 questions, and Price and I have gotten to the point where we talk about this in our home every day all day, and maybe we're not the best people to ask those questions. So I'm really glad we get to do this today. A couple of terms that are helpful. So first of all, I want to talk about neurodiversity. So neuro just means brain. Neurology is the study of the brain. Neurodiversity is about brain diversity. So you can talk about a whole group. We can talk about the neurodiversity in this room. We can talk about the neurodiversity of our listeners. We can talk about the neurodiversity on a specific college campus, whatever it is. It's just describing that all of our brains look different. Just like you can look out and see a sea of people who all look physically different from one another, our brains all are wired slightly differently. So that's neurodiversity. We're just describing how different human brains can be from one another.
Even in a family, even in a small little unit like a family.
Sure, even in a small unit like a family, you could talk about the neurodiversity of that family. Neurodivergence is about a smaller portion of that group of people who differ from what we refer to as the norm, or somebody who's neurotypical. So neurotypical is the way that most brains function. It's what's typical. And then there's neurodivergent, which means it diverges from the norm. It's different from the norm, and it makes up a whole host of different neurotypes.
And that's kind of my next question.
Yeah.
What conditions are under this umbrella? And I'm not sure that condition is the right term to use, but I'm going to use it because that's what I know to use.
Yeah.
And this is a place where we can learn more about that.
Yeah.
So is it autism? Is it ADHD? Is it Asperger's? Is it OCD? Like, what are the things that make up neurodivergent people
Yeah.
that are outside of the norm,
That's
outside of neurotypical?
Yes, that's a perfect question. So, conditions, I think, is a word that we would move away from specifically because we all know it's being implied when somebody says somebody else has a condition.
They're sick.
Right, we're about to say something bad about them.
Right.
Like
It's a
something.
negative thing.
Exactly. And this is literally just a difference in neurotype. There are a lot of strengths that come along with having a differently wired brain, and there are a lot of things that are a big challenge that come along with having a differently wired brain. But honestly, most of those challenges have to do with trying to operate in an environment that is not built for your brain. It's built for a typical brain, it's built for a neurotypical group of people. Um, Some people would also use the term like different diagnoses that fall under this umbrella.
Right.
If I'm talking about it, I would say there are different neurotypes. There are different types of brains that fall under this category.
Okay.
So neurodivergence covers autism, ADHD. It actually covers a wide host of things. Some people put anxiety under this umbrella if somebody
Okay.
has like a chronic anxiety sort of condition. Again, there's that word condition. But
What about like depression? Would that be? I mean, I
strange.
don't know that I would consider that neurodivergent
Yeah.
as much as it might be a clinical mental health
Yeah.
condition. And
That's a
there's the
good
word. Now we're
question.
going to just say
Right, now we're
condition
gonna
the
say it.
entire time. But so is depression? That's a diagnosis. And
Right.
but does that necessarily mean that you have a neurodivergent brain?
It's a good question. So far, anxiety I've seen off and on the list. I don't see it on some lists and I see it on others. I haven't yet seen depression on a list. I feel like if anxiety is on one, depression makes sense. But
Right.
most of the commonly accepted things ADHD, autism, OCD, Tourette's, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia,
What's dyscalculia?
like dyslexia but with numbers.
Okay.
Yeah. And the very interesting thing about some of those things is that we have really, thank you, Alice the cat, who's here with me, helping me through. The thing with a lot of those is that we've broken down dyslexia as like one thing. Like, what is dyslexia?
When you switch letters in a word.
Right.
That's what I think
it's
of.
something somebody struggles with reading. There's maybe switching letters or words seem moved on a page. It's actually a whole neurotype. And
Okay.
there are a lot of other traits that go along with something like dyslexia. It tends to also come along with being, I believe it's called top down thinking, where you tend to think about the whole picture first and then fill in details. Unlike autism, where we tend to be bottom up thinkers and we want to know every single detail about something before we really are ready to talk about a big picture.
Okay.
It can come with different spatial reasoning and awareness. There's a lot of different things that come along with this, but we've kind of put these things into one box. A couple of other things that you mentioned that are important. You mentioned Asperger's. That's a word that is being phased out in usage.
I think I heard that
Yeah.
that's something that they're not using anymore, but I don't understand why.
Yeah. So there are some people who are diagnosed with that when they were kids, and we've considered that those folks are still allowed to call themselves that. They receive that diagnosis, they've grown up with it. If that's what makes them comfortable, that's okay. But it was two things. It has some Nazi ties. Dr. Asperger.
Well, that's always positive.
Right.
That's always a great thing when you're going to have something tied to the
It's
Nazis.
really not going to set you up for a long
Awesome.
legacy. So, and it was basically a way of sorting out like quote unquote useful autistic people from non-useful autistic people. And
Ooh.
so it's a really gross ableist term that was also tied to like death and dying for people. So it's a term that we're no longer using, certainly for diagnosis, and that a lot of people are moving away from. Another term that gets brought up a lot is ADD versus ADHD. But ADD is also a word that is no longer a diagnostic term. because we now know that it's all the same thing. They're just different presentations.
And that's really an important thing that I want to mention right now.
Okay.
Like, it's not wrong for somebody to say that somebody else has Asperger's. When I was a young adult, I knew a young person that had been diagnosed with Asperger's. He had some very specific behaviors that were that really clued you in that something different was going on with him.
Yeah.
And he even referred to himself as like having being an Aspie.
Being an
I think
Aspie was a
an
term.
Aspie,
Yeah.
but just like many other areas in our society, the science is moving quickly. And if you're not a clinical therapist, you're just a normal person doing your normal thing, maybe trying to be intelligent and aware
Yeah.
of these things. You don't know that Asperger's is no longer being used. And
Right.
so I would say to be patient,
Yeah.
people that are in your field, to be patient with those of us that are not
Yeah.
in this field, because we can't keep up with all of the differences. And like if somebody says, oh, I think that person has Asperger's, likely, number one, they don't know about the Nazis.
Right.
And they don't know that it's not a term that is being phased out, and so
Yeah.
it's just an opportunity to learn and to get some instruction there that you don't know. And so I don't even know how somebody stays up on that if they're not neurodivergent themselves or have a
Yeah.
family member that are. Like, how do you really know that these are terms? Like, I didn't know ADD isn't
Right.
really being used anymore.
Right. I've seen a lot of clinicians still use the term ADD. I think it got phased out like 20 years ago. Like
Oh,
it's
wow.
done for a
Okay.
long time and people are still using it. I know people are still using Asperger's. And also we've had comments on our own videos of people being like, I don't want people to take this word away from me. This is the word that I was given as my diagnosis. Like I've learned to now live my life with this word. It was maybe hard for me to accept early on. Now it's a part of my life. And just because somebody did something horrible like a long time ago before I was born, I don't feel like I want to live with the
Right.
consequences of that. And I totally get that. Yes, this is a very specialized area. This is something where if you're not learning about it all of the time, you won't know these things. So I think about gauging the level of importance of something.
Right.
Asperger's feels like has such a harmful history. That's one that I may be more quick to educate somebody on who feels open to learning, who wants to learn
Right.
about the community and would like to use more updated terminology. But honestly, like, folks might tell me like, hey, I have ADD or I have a kid who has ADD. We can just have that conversation.
You don't
You
have
don't have to
you
get
don't
it
have to
right all of
straighten
the
them out
time.
every time.
And that's the other reason I'm excited about this episode and about talking with you, because I think there are some things that, according to the community, aren't going to be quite correct that we're talking about. And that's you're allowed to access a space and be new to it. You're allowed to be new
Right.
here. And it's something I hear from a lot of folks, even who are getting a diagnosis that they're neurodivergent. They're like, I just got here and I'm wrong already. Like I can't even talk about what's going on with me because I don't feel like the community gets me. So this is, at least here in this podcast world, it's a safe place. You can ask questions and not know the terminology. I think that's really, really important.
Well, and that's so unfortunate that someone who is just learning this about themselves or about a friend or a family member, and they're asking those beginner questions,
Yeah.
and that probably everyone with a lot of experience are like, oh, that question again. But it's such a great opportunity to educate someone who's really trying to learn,
Yeah.
and it's about learning new words and a new language, and you're not
It's a
going to get
new
that right at first.
vocab. Yeah, for
I
sure.
mean, so you have the hurdle of maybe being concerned about what you're hearing about yourself or your family member, and you don't fully grasp it, and then you're trying to learn this whole new language, and then while you're getting it, you're making some mistakes. Somebody has to come in and school you on, you're a Nazi.
Right. You're like, I just want to know what's going on with my kid and I have to be able to talk about it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, what are some of the behaviors that people could be on the lookout for that lets them know that somebody is or might be neurodivergent? And one of the examples that I wanted to mention is when I was a child, we didn't talk about people in terms of being introverted or extroverted.
Mm-hmm.
Like a person was shy,
Yeah.
and shy was a big a word that covered a
A
lot.
lot of things.
And it
Yeah.
really did mean introverted. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, so I know just in normal society, we don't necessarily say about anyone anymore, oh, that person is shy.
Mm-hmm.
We would probably say that person's an introvert.
Yeah.
And we all, I think, culturally understand that a little bit better. Um, so, what are some of the things that you might notice about
Mm-hmm.
someone who is neurodivergent, and that would help you know there's probably something not typical going on with that person?
Mm-hmm.
Give me some examples of something that you might observe out or that other people might notice.
Yeah. Um, I think what's important to know here, once again, like we all just have brains that are slightly different from one another.
Mm-hmm.
That, that's what neurodiversity is talking about. Our brains are different from one another. And there are a lot of neurodivergent people you'll encounter and you won't know.
You would never know.
And I think that sometimes we've made the threshold to be, it should be obvious. And if it's not obvious, it's clearly not happening.
Mm-hmm.
If I can't spot it, then it's not what's going on.
So,
And that,
like for me, no one knows that I have a pretty strong inclination to chew the same number of times on each side of my mouth.
right.
Somebody might call that OCD. I have
Mm-hmm.
never received a diagnosis,
Uh-huh.
but I do know that the chewing that happens on the right side is going to have to be the same number of
It's
times on the left
exactly
side.
even on the
So
other side.
nobody's going to look at me and say you're OCD because that's not
Yeah.
something that anyone
I've
knows about. They can't look at me and see
I've now
anything like
known
that.
you for a good period of time and I had no idea that this was happening. We've shared many a meal together. So
It's
yes.
very important. There's counting happening.
So first of all, I think it's important that like if you don't know the person, you are not the determiner of this, and that's not. It sounds like none of your business.
Right?
Having that sort of information, but there are things that can be helpful about knowing or about spotting it in your own family. Something else about neurodivergence is that it tends to run in families. People who are neurodivergent tend to come from very neurodivergent families. People who are neurodivergent tend to find themselves in very neurodivergent friend groups.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of all,
So
draw
maybe that's
to
a
one
thing of
another.
you feel like you fit in with that group.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And so it's often missed within those families because they're like, we're all like that. So you're not different. And that's an issue I find with my clients now is that they're now this new generation in their family. And their family's like, we're all like that. We're all a little whatever.
Right.
You're not different. And it's like, okay, but you can acknowledge that our family is a little different, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe there's something going on here. So the next thing, and then we'll actually just get into the answer to this question. But the next thing is that neurodivergence covers a wide range of different neurotypes, and those things are pretty different. But kind of chronically, I hear from those people exactly what you're saying. It's about like fitting in. And I think that there are sometimes kids who get labeled as like shy. I was a shy kid. Everybody
Mm-hmm.
called me shy. Who get labeled as shy or weird. Um, or they're just like unique. They're just, beat of their own drum, that sort of stuff. I feel like we're probably now starting to talk about neurodivergent people when we're
Mm-hmm.
identifying those kiddos. It's about, right now, the statistic is that about 15 to 20% of people are neurodivergent. Um, I
So
expect
it's not as rare.
it's not as rare, and I honestly expect that number to increase as more and more people get access to knowing. I didn't know until I was an adult. I now
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of family members who are like, oh, this is me. So now they've gone another whole generation or two generations of not knowing that this was true of them. I think
Right.
that number is going to grow, but right now we know it's about 15 to 20%. Um, and there's this like chronic feeling of not fitting in, of being different. Individually, a lot of the things that we tend to notice. So that's the other important thing. What we're actually describing is just a difference in your brain.
Right.
The traits that you're seeing are a result of the difference in your brain. They are not the thing. So if we talk about autism as like flapping your hands in public, and that's what people want to talk about, that is part of having a difference in your brain. That's not the thing itself.
And that is a coping mechanism.
Exactly.
Okay. And so that's a coping mechanism that more than one person
Yes.
with autism has developed.
Yes.
So there are similarities in
Yes.
coping mechanisms. And so, as that, using that as an example, you're out at the park and
Mm-hmm.
you see someone doing that.
Yeah.
What's the appropriate response? I'm assuming mind your own business is number one
Yeah.
on the list, right? But if you were to see somebody, maybe that they seem agitated or like they're upset and they don't seem
Mm-hmm.
to have anybody around them.
Yeah.
Like as a mom, I'm always like, if I see a little kid running around and it looks like they don't have a parent or they're scared and they're looking for someone,
Yeah.
like I take notice of that.
Yep.
And so that outward behavior is something that you can see.
Yeah.
So you just keep going about your own business, or you just kind of observe to make sure that they're okay, they're safe, they're with their people. And what do you recommend? Like, what do you think about that? What's a good thought to have about that?
Yeah, I think so. The thing that we tend to have in common, and now we're kind of specifically talking about autistic kids, um, is that our nervous systems are dysregulated. Our brains, what is different about our brains is that we're taking in way more information, probably about 47% more information all the time, which is very overwhelming. And then add that person into a noisy environment, like
Mm-hmm.
maybe a playground or an environment with bright lights like the grocery store, and you've got like a frustrated, freaked out kid,
Right.
probably.
Really difficult. They're having a really difficult time just handling the environment.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's when you're going to start to notice. Now, stimming can happen also when you're happy. It's just any kind of big feeling moving through your body. But if you're feeling overwhelmed, you're going to do self calming behaviors or stimming behaviors like flapping your hands or like moving your body or um, yeah, those sorts of things that we notice in those kids. Something Price and I noticed recently at the movie theater is there was a kiddo who was wanting to repeat back the most interesting things that were being said
Mm-hmm.
in the movie. So every time somebody, a big moment in a movie, when somebody would say a very funny line or somebody would say a surprising line or a big deal line, the kid would shout it out back to the screen. That's something called echolalia. And that's also a calming, stimming behavior. And it feels good and interesting in our mouths to get to repeat fun and exciting things, just like you watch something with a friend and you guys repeat lines back to each other
Right.
from it. That's happening in real time. So if you're noticing these things, if you're noticing a kid alone and in distress, I think you can respond in the way you would respond to a kid who's alone and in distress. The one thing to keep in mind in this situation is that um, I think autistic kids could potentially be more likely to be more dependent on their one caregiver or their two, whoever the safe
Mm-hmm.
people in their life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we have a really low tolerance for unsafe feeling things. And so if you notice the kid is feeling really alarmed and startled, that might be a kid that you're not getting up close to try to calm, but
Right.
that you're doing more of the searching for a safe adult
Mm-hmm.
in their life to make sure that the adult is catching that they're in distress.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
That totally makes sense. So some of those things are more outward.
Yeah.
There's something that people can see.
I think the more important reason to get to notice those things is like it's really annoying to walk into a movie theater and have somebody shouting back to the screen and,
But if you know about it, if you know, like you've listened to this podcast or
exactly.
you've read an article and you know that that's a thing that people do, that they're trying to cope with their environment,
Yeah.
then instead of it being annoying, you can relax and you can just let that person be who they are, because they're not trying to be distracting.
Right.
It's not about you.
It's not about you.
It's not
Yeah.
about you. And so just knowing that can really help
Yeah.
you accept it. and accommodate that behavior.
That's why so much of this podcast is just that it's education. It's just
Right.
like getting exposure to these things. I was reading another story recently about somebody who was at a park and there was another dad sitting on a bench near a swing set and their kid was using up one of the like only two swings on the playground.
Mm-hmm.
And the dad was like, "I'm sorry, I know he's been taking a long time and you have kids waiting for turns on the swings. It's how he regulates his nervous system. And we come here every day to get to do this. I know he's taking a long time, but like this is what we're here to do." And because that parent was learning a lot about neurodiversity and neurodivergent kids, they were like, "Oh, that actually makes sense to me." And now instead of being annoyed at you for taking up this swing, it's like, where else do you have access to something like
Right.
this?
Like
This
move
is
on and
exactly
go
where you
play
need to.
somewhere else
Yeah.
and come back to the swings later. And
Yeah.
I think that understanding really, it does go a long way.
Yeah.
What about some of the more hidden behaviors or coping mechanisms that neurodivergent people maybe do to get through their day? Is maybe not something that we would notice, but I'm just interested to know what are some of the other coping mechanisms. Now, I have a friend who has OCD, and
Mm-hmm.
I have observed some behaviors that get that person through their day.
Yeah.
And and they'll apologize like, I'm sorry it's taking me so long to do this, but I know that they have a process.
Right.
They have a process that they go through, and they have to go through that process 4 or 5 times, and it really doesn't matter to me. It
Yeah.
takes like 3 minutes, and then we're out the door.
Yeah.
And so knowing that diagnosis is there and that person is coping, that is something I can see. But I know that I've heard from another person
Mm-hmm.
that there's a lot of hidden things that
Yeah.
people do to cope, and that sounds like that could be really hard, really, really hard. So help me understand what some of those things are.
Yeah. I think that's why it's important to just like believe people about themselves and to like listen to the people in your life because our brains are so different and we respond so differently. You might not know what somebody's doing just to try to
Right.
get through their day. And there are a lot of things that it takes. So I think that we'll just kind of focus predominantly on ADHD and autism. Those are kind of the big
Okay.
two that we talk about on the podcast, since those are our experiences. But with ADHD, I have folks who have to set alarms not only to help them, alarms to like help keep track of the day, alarms to remind them to like eat. I've had ADHD
Okay.
folks where you can get so into something called hyper focus, that you lose touch with what's going on with your body. And they've dealt with like UTIs from sitting and focusing on their task
Okay.
for too long and missing going to the bathroom. Um, there's so dealing with like time blindness is one of those things that's part of hyper focus where you lose track of time. Um, Dealing with needing a lot of stimulation in your environment and sitting in an environment that feels empty and devoid of stimulation and trying to focus on one thing can make it impossible to focus. So they're, playing with a toy or they're doing something to try to engage more of their brain and allow them
Or
to
like
actually like
listening to
focus.
music,
Listening to
different
music.
things. Okay.
Yep. For me with autism, it tends to run a little bit more the opposite direction. Autism and ADHD aren't opposites, and about 80% of people are both. So there's a lot of overlap in that community. But for me with autism, it's it's a lot more my environment. Again, taking in more information all the time. It's very overwhelming to me. So even before I'm leaving the house to show up to the place where you're seeing me, there's a lot more like mental preparation, a lot more physical presentation or preparation. There's a joke about autistic people amongst ourselves about going to things with a backpack or going to things with like a big bag
Mm-hmm.
because we don't know what sort of thing we're going to meet in our environment.
You
And
got to be
we're
prepared.
more sensitive to like temperatures. So I need to make sure, what if I get hot? What if I get cold?
Okay.
More sensitive to loud noises. So I have earplugs that help to drown out noise, but I can't eat in them because they make the inside noises louder and my
Mm-hmm.
chewing is too loud for me. So I also have earplugs that don't block noise, they funnel noise. And then I have like AirPods in case I need to listen to something and focus on. Like it's just that's too many things for that's 3 things right now in my purse for just my ears and hearing.
Okay.
That's a lot of things. It can be things like bringing sunglasses to something, trying to wear clothing that's going to be comfortable all day, I almost never lose the sensation of like what it feels like for my clothes to be sitting on my body.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to plan ahead for those things. Are my comfortable clothes still going to be appropriate for the environment that we're in? Um, and then the other thing that you're not seeing on the other end of that is the decompression on when I get home, is that I'm exhausted from that. So a week with like back to back social activities isn't, it's something I used to do, and that starts to cause something called burnout, which is actually a brain injury. It looks more like a physical trauma to your brain on a brain scan. Um,
It's so interesting that you say that because just the other day I was reading an article about high level C suite executives
yeah.
that after 2 or 3 or 4 years of being in a startup, and getting round one funding and all of that sort of stuff, and they build this amazing company and
Mm-hmm.
then they drop off the grid.
Yep.
It's because they have truly and literally burned out.
Yes. Yeah.
And I know some of those people, at least 20% of them, it
Mm-hmm.
sounds like, are probably neurodivergent,
Yeah.
and they literally cannot anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even with like ADHD, um, there can be this ability to like hyper focus and hyper engage with something that's exciting to you, or that feels urgent, or that's new or challenging, and to really pour all of yourself into it. And it's amazing strength to have, but there's not a lot of breaks. In
Right.
fact, like literally, the part of your brain that acts as brakes tends to be underdeveloped in an ADHD brain. And that is really, really challenging, to not be able to notice the signs that you need to stop, or to not be able to engage the brakes when you notice that. And they'll work past the point of burnout as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true for a lot of folks. I mean, if you're dealing with OCD and you're dealing with the obsessions and compulsions that come with that, and you've always got these cycling thoughts and maybe different routines or rituals you need to follow through with to keep your nervous system regulated, you're doing way more than the
Yeah.
same person who than a neurotypical person doing the same job as you during the
Right.
day. There
Right.
are like 18 more steps for you to get there and get through it. And that's exhausting. But yeah, the burnout is real, and it's a real injury to your brain.
So, if someone in your family, or maybe a friend or a colleague, confides in you, or tells you openly that they have a diagnosis like this,
Mhm.
um, what are some of the things that you can do to support that person? It sounds like, number one, the first thing that jumps to my mind is, if you notice that they've been sitting at their desk for 5 hours and they haven't moved,
Yeah.
you probably should go and say, hey, why don't you come and let's, take a walk around the building, or
Mhm.
let's get a snack. Have you had lunch yet? I'd love to sit and have lunch with you, or whatever. Like, to just to help remind them that they maybe need a break and a
Mhm.
drink of water.
Yeah.
And they probably should also go to the bathroom before they get another UTI.
Right.
So, what are some of those types of things that you think that, hey, Alice, stop
The
pushing
cat is
on my
not
iPad.
helping.
Those are my
She's
those are
decided the
my
podcast
notes.
is over.
So, what can we do practically to
Yeah.
support family member? But I'm even thinking specifically of friends or colleagues that maybe have confided that they have this diagnosis, and no one needs you to probably be their mom or
Right.
to be nosy, or like, what's that line there?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think always the first thing is just asking them, like, what's a way that I can support you? Let me know if you need anything. Is there something I need to like know about you that's particularly difficult that we could, troubleshoot together and
Right?
kind of figure out what to do? I think that in all of our environments, we tend to need safe people who know what's going on. Sometimes I'm maxed out, and early on, it felt really overwhelming to think about really sharing kind of authentically with Price about like what was going on with me and what was overwhelming, because it feels embarrassing. It's a lot to say, and know that it's
Mm-hmm.
very vulnerable for somebody to be sharing these things. It's a big show of trust. But to be able to now be in a situation where I'm feeling overwhelmed and Price is able to be like, do you want me to tell him? Do you want me to help? Or do you want me to get you out of here? Do you want me to, that
Right?
sort of stuff
Right?
is so helpful. Making a so getting to be their safe person, having a plan with that person ahead of time. If you're maybe going out to an event together, you're going out to do something. Is there something?
Like a way that they can say, hey, it's really loud in here. I can't take anymore. I got to get out. Or I'm
Yeah.
going to go outside and just take a break.
Yep. And
Okay.
knowing that when you're already overwhelmed, that's the worst time to try to communicate. So like, you want
Right.
to have a code word with me before we go, so that like you can, tug on
Mm-hmm.
your ear and let me know it's time to leave. Um, that stuff can be helpful. Um, Another thing that's really important to us is routine. So if you're a family
Okay.
member, like agreeing to join in a routine with us,
Mm-hmm.
if you're maybe a partner to somebody who's figuring out that they're neurodivergent, it can be helpful for like the household to get into a routine together. And then also know that change is hard. So even something that's like helpful, like maybe making sure somebody's getting up to walk around and stretch and eat and do those things. Change is hard, and when you're in the middle of focusing, it's hard to switch tasks very suddenly when your brain is really headed all that direction. And so knowing that like those conversations are probably taking place outside of the moments where you're like, I think I've identified a need right now. And
Okay.
you should be
Mm-hmm.
talking about that ahead of time, because people have different ways of dealing with that. But like getting to have a conversation, especially if you like share a home with somebody, like, are you getting to eat at regular times? Do you want me to come get you when it's lunchtime? I've heard so many people say like, man, and okay, this is true for me too. I'll be going about my day and Price is like, I'm getting hungry. Are you hungry? I'm like, I didn't notice it, but now that you're talking about food, I'm very
Yeah.
excited. I
Yes,
think I
as a
might be
matter of fact.
hungry.
Okay.
So those sorts of things are good, but talking about it outside of the moment, I think, is important too. So asking them directly and then not having that conversation in the middle of like a high pressure situation.
Right, right. Yeah, like know your time. Have some good timing on that.
Have some good timing. Yeah.
Okay. So, if you have a child, a young child,
Mm-hmm.
or a teen, a young adult, how could how can you talk to children or young adults about neurodivergent people and some
Mm-hmm.
of the challenges that they might face and help them have a greater appreciation and understanding of those people so that they can, be an informed citizen of the world?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that while you're having conversations with your kids about the external stuff that they might notice,
Right.
the questions that kids ask where they'll notice that somebody looks different from them or
Hmm.
you know, is in a wheelchair instead of walking, or their skin's a different color, or they wear a different style of clothing than you do, or whatever. Kids are asking those questions externally when they're curious about the world in that way. I'm me and I exist, but I'm also now realizing that other people exist and
Right.
they are them and they are different. Making sure that those conversations also include that, like, there are a lot of things that can be different about other people that we can't see, because sometimes even our brains are different. And getting to share that, like, sometimes that can make the world overwhelming for somebody. And sometimes, in that, like, we have to get to know people individually. And if you have friends who are sharing with you that, like, they struggle with something in particular or situations are overwhelming to them, like, what are things that we do in our home when we're feeling stressed? What are things we do in our home when we're feeling overwhelmed? And knowing and like building that compassion and empathy for that.
Right.
Because then they can go off and discover those encounters and figure out what those unique friends need from them. But
Right.
I think that that sort of thing can be helpful. Another thing is, yeah, talking to kids about things like, I think bullying is a big deal. I think a lot of neurodivergent kids grow up being like feeling on the outside again, and other people tend to notice. Other people tend to notice that you're weird or different.
That's why I was thinking about this question in particular,
Yeah.
because I know people who have teens who they have done these things. They have
Mhm.
had these conversations. They have talked to them about people who are different, being accepting of people of all kinds. Like
Mhm.
you said, that the external things that we notice, how
Yeah.
they look, what color their skin is, all of those
Yeah.
things. But they have teenagers who are bullies.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't realize it. Maybe they don't think, that their little angel could
Right.
ever do anything like that. But I do. We all know that that happens. There are
Yeah.
mean kids at school.
Oh, for sure.
Probably their parents weren't teaching them to be mean. Kids
Yeah.
are mean.
Yeah.
And so that's why I was curious to know, like, how can adults talk to their children and their teenagers about this, because it really is important.
Yeah.
And helping them have the tools to navigate that and even stand up for people who are being bullied. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
really difficult to do when you're a child or you're a teenager, and feeling acceptance is so important.
Oh, for sure.
And so, any other ideas about what you can do to help your kids or your teenagers encourage them
Yeah.
in those ways?
Well, I have a couple thoughts. One is about just building like a really warm and loving, accepting home environment. It's a huge deal for kids to get to come home to somewhere that absolutely does feel safe for them. And I sometimes hear the narrative of like, well, if you're too soft on your kids, they're not going to be able to deal with the real world. Like if you're always soft and sweet and warm, they're not going to be able to go out and deal with it. Like no, the only way that you know that there is like goodness in the world and you know to seek out those people, you know not to hang out around people who are shitty to you because that feels like the only thing that exists, is to know what it's like to be in an environment that fully loves and accepts you. So it's your job to create that anchor of a totally loving environment. So when they do encounter bullies, they're like, these are not the cool kids I'm trying to impress.
Right.
These are kids I want nothing to do with. This looks sad. I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to be a part of that. The other thing is really understanding. I think that it's maybe easier for people with maybe something visibly different to know, and maybe not for everybody. But the reason that we bully people is to like deal with our own discomfort. Like we bully people about the things we're sensitive about. We bully people about the things that we hope nobody notices about us or that we feel fearful of, or it feels impossible to try to imagine a life dealing with that thing. Like we bully to protect ourselves from that, and making sure that your kids know that when they're encountering that, that bullying doesn't have anything to do with you. Like, even if they're touching on something that is a real difference about you, bullying doesn't have anything to do with you. And the other thing specifically about neurodivergent kids or teens as they're growing up is that a lot of the times they feel like, because there's not an obvious physical difference a lot of the times, they feel like they must be like everybody else, but they're just worse at life. A lot of them grow up feeling like, I can't see the difference in our brains. I'm not even thinking of that. I was never thinking about that as a kid. I was just like, it takes me so much longer to do my homework because I'm stupid, not because my brain is processing so many more things. I get so much more frustrated because I'm just not a good kid, not because my clothes are bothering me all day. And it's like helping
Right.
kids to know that sometimes our brains are different, and that if you're struggling in something, that's something I want to know about. Like that's something that is okay to talk about, that we can work through and we can make a plan around, and that I'm going
Right.
to advocate on your behalf. Um,
Well, even if somebody feels like they have a hard time making friends,
yeah.
and that's something that probably everyone feels
Right.
at some point. But if they have a really hard time making friends, then that would be very isolating and
Yeah.
easy to just blame yourself for.
Right.
Well, nobody likes me because I'm not fun or I'm not cool or
Mhm.
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That also brings up like a totally different thought for me, but sometimes neurodivergent kids are playing in ways that are different from other kids.
Mhm.
For instance, I thought it was way more fun to line up all of my toys in order, or line up all of the household shoes by size and color and type as a small child before I'm remembering this stuff happening. Um, and to also keep in mind, this is again about the creating like the warm, nourishing home environment, is that like different isn't bad. In that when you're telling your kid, like, that's not the way you play with those toys, you're already starting to initiate that, like, I just do things wrong. I just am a kid
You're
who
not
gets
doing it
things
right.
wrong. Like, when I do something that feels good and natural to me, that's probably not what I'm supposed to do. And that's where like masking is born. That's where putting on that like pretend socially acceptable facade that's very costly to neurodivergent people comes in. And so you get to create an environment that's like you get to play with your toys however you want to. And my goal for you is to be able to connect with people who love the things that you love, not who tell you that something about you is wrong,
Got it.
and trusting your own gut. So,
Okay, so this is my last question.
okay.
So, what are some things that neurodivergent people wish that other people knew or understood about them? And I know that that's great generalities. You
Yeah.
can't speak for every person, but what are you, from what you hear with your clients
Yep.
and what you've experienced yourself and observed as a clinical therapist, what do you think are some things that we should know?
I think I think people really need to be believed about themselves. And I want to encourage people listening, if you've been given this by like a friend or a family member, I want to encourage you that like it's safe to just believe people about themselves. That if it seems weird that like your niece or your nephew or somebody in your life is like trying to put a term to something that seems like it just runs in the family, or they're
Mm-hmm.
trying to like, you know, yeah, put a name to something that doesn't matter, that maybe everybody struggles with, or maybe it's just weird about, like, these terms are really benefiting people to understand that like they're not broken and that their brain just works differently. And it's the most beautiful thing in the world that like our brains work so differently. And we are desperately, deeply needed in our communities and in the world. And people need to be believed about themselves. And also then people need to be like loved and accepted as they are. Because something else that happens in the community is that we're much more at risk for depression, anxiety,
Mm.
thinking about suicide, dying by suicide, like all of these really big, heavy duty, scary topics that feel like maybe they happen to other people, but not to our friends, not to our family members. Neurodivergent people are significantly more at risk for them. And it kind of depends slightly on the different diagnoses, but like they are much more at risk for those things because of that deep seated belief that like something is wrong with me. And so if you have somebody in your life trying to share with you that maybe something is different about them, make sure to really hear them out. And it's really important that those folks know, and that the people who are trusting you enough to share this information with you know that they are not broken, that their brain works beautifully just as it should, and that their brain is deeply needed just as it is.
Well, at the end of the day, we all just want to be loved and valued and respected,
Yeah.
and we want to find our place in the world.
Yeah, connection is a need. It is our brain is literally wired for it. Everybody's brain is literally wired for connection. It's what we're set up for. It's what we desperately need in this world. And like choose that over everything else. Choose that over like feeling like you need to nail the vocab,
Right,
pick connection.
right. Okay, well, Ash, thank you for your time today.
Lolly, thank you for your time.
You're welcome. And Price and Ashlyn, we'll see you next time on My Son Married Your Therapist.
You did so good hosting the podcast.
Thank you. Don't tell Price, but I really only agreed to do this because he's going to fix dinner.
I love when Price fixes
And
dinner.
I think he should have to clean up too. What do you think?
I think that's a great idea. That seems like a fair trade.
I agree.
Okay, we'll break the news.